Good evening, friends. Before I start, I would like to briefly explain the background of the situation my family and I found ourselves in. We used to live in a small neighborhood in the northern part of Arizona, and when we first moved there, the area was much quieter than it is now. However, from the beginning, there was crime and drug activity in the larger neighborhood. This was no secret, and we knew it when we moved in. I kindly ask that my name not be revealed because the story I'm about to share could have serious repercussions for me and my family if I am identified soon. Due to the remote location of our home, the immediate area was free from drug dealing. Occasionally, we would hear gunshots in the distance, but they were far enough away that we didn't feel directly affected. Life in our home was generally peaceful, and the only times we experienced tension were when we had to pass through known drug-dealing locations on our way out. However, as the years passed, the neighborhood started to change over time, and the once quiet surroundings near our home became unrecognizable. Overnight, makeshift shacks started to appear in the vacant lots close to our home, and within months, those shacks were converted into houses and the once secluded area began to become crowded. Our nightmare started when a drug-dealing operation quickly set up shop a few yards from our front gate. The area was remote and surrounded by dense, undeveloped woods, which turned into a dumping ground and a covert cemetery for the local criminal gangs. From our home, we could hear the cries of the victims, their fervent requests for mercy, and the horrifying screams of people who knew they were going to die. Frequently, the bodies weren't even buried. Instead, they were left in the open woods, drawing vultures and giving off an intolerable stench. What had once been a reasonably tranquil existence became a daily nightmare. We started keeping the windows closed, but the stench continued to enter, and to make things worse, my father lost his job. So we had to rely on the odd jobs he could find to make ends meet. Moving away was just not an option for us. Heavy rain is always nerve-wracking, and one storm night things took a much darker turn for anyone living in an area like ours. My father and I were up at 3 a.m, watching the rain pour down the hill behind our house. At first, we assumed that the figures emerging from the woods might be people seeking shelter from the storm, but something about them didn't feel right. When we noticed something strange, the drug-dealing spot was deserted, which made sense given the time and the story. We quickly realized that these figures weren't normal. They were floating and appeared to be aimlessly wandering because of the peculiar glow that their bodies emitted in the darkness. Traveling aimlessly and without direction, even stranger was the fact that they didn't look like the conditions they came from. It was raining and the woods were muddy, but these figures appeared clean and dry. My father was visibly shaken and couldn't comprehend what we were seeing. They had human-like shapes but no faces or feet, and they gradually started to float higher into the air. The hillside where they appeared didn't have street lights at the time, so the glow they emitted was even more noticeable against the darkness. My father and I stood frozen, watching as the light from their bodies started to fade within minutes, disappearing entirely before our terrified eyes. We shut all the curtains and stayed up all night because we were too afraid to go outside. We tried to make sense of what had happened in the days that followed. From our window, we could see the horrific events that occurred in those woods, including the victims being dragged into the darkness and their screams resonating through the air. On nights when the screams became more intense, my father would turn on the radio to block out the noise. But every time we looked outside, we saw those glowing figures floating across the top of the hill and emerging from the woods. I started to realize that these were spirits because people passing by seemed to be completely unaware of the figures' presence, but they seemed to notice us. One night, my father and I decided we couldn't keep looking and decided to stay in our rooms and avoid the windows at all costs. However, that decision didn't protect us for long because I was woken up by one of those glowing figures that had entered my room. The light was so bright that for a brief moment, I thought the midday sun had filled my house. It was so bright that I couldn't see anything else for a few minutes. Some of them would stop right in front of our gate, as if they were staring directly into our eyes, after hearing everything. The figure told us that the souls of those who had been killed in the woods were restless and unable to find peace. She explained that these were probably people whose loved ones had died. I felt as though I had completely lost my sight. The figure didn't say anything. It just stood there staring at me, or at least it seemed terrified. I ran to my father's room, where he was already awake, and we clung to each other in terror, praying and crying. The presence of the figure left us stunned. Mothers, wives, and kids still mourning them. She felt that these spirits were pleading for assistance, desperate for some kind of resolution, because their lives had been cut short in such a violent and cruel way, and many of the victims had not even been properly buried, left to rot in the woods. She told us that the only thing we could do was to inform the authorities of what we knew, so we did just that. We started calling the police anonymously in the hopes that they would look into it. We did this every day at first, but nothing came of it. On one of these calls, the operator flatly stated that the area was too dangerous for officers to look into, making it apparent that sending a team there wasn't a priority. After 3 days of perseverance, my father, frustrated, started recording these calls and sent them to the authorities' oversight department. Only then, with the assistance of a helicopter unit, did multiple teams finally arrive to investigate the woods, discovering dozens of bodies buried and dispersed throughout the area. What transpired next was astounding. That night, the apparition came to a complete halt, and for the first time in years, the hill was silent. The glowing figures never reappeared. It seemed as though the body's discovery and removal had finally brought them peace and allowed them to rest. A while has passed since all of this occurred. My father is now deceased, and my wife and I have moved to a different area of the neighborhood nearer the main road. I was able to sell the house, and while I have never returned, I occasionally wonder if the current family has gone through anything comparable. Even though life here can be extremely challenging at times, I sincerely hope that most of the people in this community are honest, decent, and hardworking. They don't deserve to face the challenges that are forced upon them. Until then, we live with faith and pray for God's protection. Thank you for listening to my story. Good night to all of you. Before we start our next story, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel right now. Only 30% of people watching our videos are subscribed, and your subscription will really help us keep creating more of these horror videos for you. Thank you so much for your support. And now sit back and relax and enjoy the video if you dare. I'm Harry, and I was born in the small state of Oklahoma. I'm 72 years old, and I've been retired for almost 15 years. I worked as a public servant for a nearby town for almost 40 years, and I have to admit that I only stopped because labor laws wouldn't let me continue. In addition, my back started to give me problems, and as the end drew near, I found it increasingly difficult to get around. I was barely able to perform my duties. A friend of my mother once told me that I was a medium, which was the most logical explanation for all the strange things I've experienced over the years. I was so passionate about my work that I even wrote a book about my experiences working as a gravedigger at the town cemetery. The manuscript has been sitting in my drawer for more than 20 years. But for now, I'm going to share with you some of the strangest things I wish I had witnessed during my time there. On average, I performed 5 or 6 burials a day. While working there, the first strange things I experienced didn't occur until I had been working there for 2 years. But even before that, as a child, I would frequently see shadows. On some days, it was even more. I also kept the graves clean, restored morels, and of course, dug graves and filled them in after the ceremonies. Hear voices and experience odd feelings. Anyone who has gone through similar experiences will know what I mean. At first, it may seem frightening, but you eventually come to realize that these are perfectly normal occurrences. I also had visions and lucid dreams that were so vivid they seemed real. Early years at the cemetery were fairly uneventful, but the first unusual event I witnessed occurred while I was working on the restoration of a morum belonging to a prominent local family deeply involved in politics. Some teenagers would jump over the cemetery walls at night, and some mothers were kept locked, and this was one of them. When I was assigned to work there, the restoration materials had already been delivered nearby. Although some might call these manifestations supernatural, I began to see them as a normal part of my life, and instead of feeling afraid, I felt curious and wanted to interact with these lost souls and help them if I could. After putting on my work clothes, grabbing the office keys, and heading over, I began sanding the walls when I heard a long whistle coming from outside near a broken window. I continued working and didn't pay much attention to the sound at first, assuming it was someone trying to frighten me and that they would eventually grow weary and leave. But after a while, it began to sound like it was coming from inside the melon. I put down the sander and cautiously looked around the room to see if anyone was there, but I went back inside and asked out loud if anyone was attempting to communicate right away. The whistle then came again, much quieter than the first time, and my right hand began to shake uncontrollably. I knew it was a supernatural manifestation as it continued to get worse. When I saw a boy sitting outside next to a grave with an old socker wearing a vintage football uniform, swinging his legs and whistling as if he were calling someone, I decided to let it happen. I wasn't afraid or alarmed. I just waited to see what would happen. The image lasted for about 5 seconds before disappearing. On another occasion, I was finishing the excavation of a grave when I felt a hand touch the top of my head. I was inside the pit, so I looked up to see if anyone was there. When I saw no one, I continued digging until I heard someone call me by my childhood nickname, Charlie Boy. I returned to the office, got a candle, and lit it on the boy's grave. His name was Robert, and the headstone stated that he had died at the age of 8, approximately 40 years ago. Only a few cousins and my brother, who lived in New York City, had called me that in the past, but none of them had done so in decades. When I emerged from the grave, I saw an elderly woman smiling kindly. I asked her if she had called me, and she replied that yes, the daisy vase my son had placed on my grave was broken. Could you please fix it? I felt incredibly honored to help this spirit find peace, and the following day I returned with the new vase and fresh daisies. I used cement to secure it to the grave, and as I worked, an incredible feeling of joy that I couldn't describe, a mixture of happiness and tranquility, came over me and caused tears to fall down my cheeks, but felt like my soul's bowed. A young woman sitting on a wooden bench close to what we called the class was one of the most remarkable things I have ever seen. A great deal because it was home to the most exquisite and lovely mothers. She was already sitting with an open book on her lap when I saw her early in the morning, just after I got to work. I worked all day, and she was always there whenever I went by or glanced in her direction. I've seen many young people, frequently goths, sitting on the same bed bench who like to read or listen to music in cemeteries. Around 6 p.m., I assumed she was one of them and left her alone when I noticed she was still there, because no one is permitted to stay inside after hours. I went up to her to tell her it was time to leave, and she looked at me as if surprised that someone had not spoken to her. I apologized and explained that the cemetery was closing, so she had to leave. She looked around confusedly before saying, "I have to go," to which she replied, "Yes, it's time to leave." Then she asked if I could walk her to the gate. I asked her if she was okay or if she needed me to call someone. As we made our way to the gate, she revealed that she frequently felt disoriented, like a sleepwalker, and couldn't remember how she got there. She thanked me and left, and I shut the gate and turned to return to the locker room when a co-worker unexpectedly noticed me and inquired as to why I had returned. He said he had just seen me walking toward the gate earlier and thought I was leaving for the day. I explained that I had only been escorting a young woman out of the cemetery, and he looked at me, perplexed, looking even more perplexed, and inquired as to what young woman I worked late into the night. But only once did I see something strange after dark. "I saw you walking to the gate talking to yourself." Many people believe that ghosts only visit cemeteries at night. She was walking among the graves in a white dress that looked like a wedding gown, and she was making a low, mournful groan that sounded like a cry of pain. I chose to follow her, but she turned the corner of a row of graves and vanished. That was the only nighttime experience I had. They always joke that cemeteries are home to lost souls, not vampires, so the idea that hauntings only happen at night is a myth. I will never forget one of the saddest things that happened to me at the cemetery. Every other strange thing that happened during the day. sometimes even under the bright midday sun. I saw the burial of two young children whose drug-addicted parents abandoned them in the house and went out to buy more drugs. Tragically, they were struck by a car on a highway overpass and died instantly. The children, ages 2 and 4, were locked inside the house for 3 days without food or water and passed away before anyone could find them. When people ask me about the saddest thing I've ever witnessed, I always think of the day at the burial when the small coffins were being lowered into the ground and the children's grandmother threw herself into the grave, screaming that she wanted to be buried with them. The discovery was horrifying. Neighbors called the fire department after noticing a terrible smell coming from the house. And when responders arrived, they discovered the two children lying lifeless on the living room floor. This saint story made headlines at the time, and many people came to the cemetery to pay their respects and leave flowers on the children's graves. When I arrived at around 6 o'clock in the morning, I went straight to the locker room to change and have a cup of coffee. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal, but then I noticed that the door to the small kitchen cabinet was open. This meant that some of the food stored inside was missing, including a box of cookies and a jar of powdered milk. The grave was delayed into the evening due to the intense grief, as many relatives refused to leave the site, forcing the cemetery to remain open much later than usual, and several packets of instant noodles were no longer there. My first assumption was that someone had broken in during the night and taken the food because I was the only person there. I locked the cabinet to show the others how things were going, and when they got there, I got my tools and went to the children's graves to start working. When I got there, I discovered not only the mess from the night before, but also the missing food scattered on top of the graves. There were empty cookie wrappers, instant noodle crumbs, and powdered milk residues all over the place, indicating that this was not a typical theft. This was the first and only time I spoke with my co-workers about such issues. Before, I had never talked about my experiences of seeing or sensing things because I didn't feel comfortable discussing things I couldn't prove. However, this time, it wasn't just something personal. Anyone could see it. All they had to do was look at the food remnants strewn about the graves and remember that those whose impoverished children had perished from starvation. Some of my co-workers didn't believe it, and one even implied that I had staged the entire incident as staff members became terrified. To wrap up this story and keep it from being too lengthy for your audience, we decided that each day we would lay 2 pieces of bread on the children's graves to make sure they would never go hungry again. After that, no more food disappeared from the kitchen. I'll tell you another story about something I saw happen while working on a flower bed by the administration building with a friend named Ben who had been employed there for many years. The cemetery administration wanted to turn the flower bed into a garden with benches and trees. When we noticed a bright light flashing at the far end of the lot near the back wall, it was past 9 o'clock p.m. We worked late into the night to better accommodate visitors for Memorial Day, which was quickly approaching. What caught our attention was the intensity of the light. If someone had been carrying a flashlight or lighter, the glow would have been much weaker. This light looked like a truck headlamp, illuminating the surrounding headstones. As you know, I'm used to such phenomena, so I wasn't worried, but Ben was paralyzed with fear. "Harry, what the hell is that?" He kept saying it to calm him down, so I suggested that it might be a powerful flashlight and urged him to resume his work. At night, we joked that the cemetery was full of goths whenever we heard or saw odd things. Still feeling uneasy, Ben muttered, "I'm not sure," but he reluctantly went back to work. The lights eventually went out, but shortly after that, we heard crackling noises that sounded like someone walking on dry twigs. This time, the noise was much closer to where we were, and Ben froze again. "Is someone there?" he asked, but of course no one answered. The situation worsened when Ben swore, heard someone call his name, and dropped the small spade he was using to dig. The area where we were working was dimly lit, and by this point, the traffic and activity outside the cemetery had subsided. Then I heard slow, deliberate steps approaching us, accompanied by the same crackling sound we had heard earlier, and behind Ben, who was frozen, appeared the figure of an elderly black man. I told him that he was just letting his imagination run wild, and reminded him that the sooner we finished, The sooner we could leave, IT took a lot to calm Tony down. I helped him to the office and gave him a glass of water with sugar, but he was so shaken that he refused to stay another minute. He asked his friend in a low voice if he could spare me a cigarette. When Ben turned around and saw the man, he screamed in fear and fell to the ground. He calmly then said, "No one here smokes, my friend. You can go in peace." Of course, the following day, Ben told everyone what had happened, that he would always pull me into the narrative and ask me to verify his observations. People laughed that he was going crazy, and whenever Ben turned to me for approval, I would simply agree with them and tell them that he had most likely imagined it all due to fatigue. When Ben repeatedly confronted me and asked why I wouldn't support him, I would always respond, "Some people aren't ready to hear certain truths." I didn't want to be written off as another storyteller who people thought was crazy or dishonest.